Hi, everyone. Hi. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi. Oh, look at this. We got lots more people in here today. Cool. Yep. All right. So there'll be a few more people. So why don't we wait for a few minutes and we'll see who shows up. Okay. Try to give it a few minutes. Just see what happens. Like the hat, Jonah.
Thank you.
All right. Let's see, there's Sarah. Hold on. Whose puppy is that?
This is mine.
Oh, can we see? Oh, what's the puppy name?
Name is Abby.
Oh, that's right. Abby. I remember you having Abby now.
Yeah,
Hi.
I was gonna bring her to class after spring break, but
Oh, right. Yeah. Hi, Abby. She's like, I hear my name. Hi, Abby.
when I don't give her attention, she gets mad.
Oh, I know. My bulldog's the same way. My bulldog hears your Abby and she just stood up. She's like, what's going on? Oh, it's okay, Lucy. It's okay. It's a computer. It's okay, Lulu. You want to come here? Come here. Come here, Lucy. All right. All right. A few more minutes. How is everybody doing so far? Hanging in there? Yeah.
We're doing all right.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Good to
How are
hear.
you?
I'm supposed to be self-quarantining.
Mm.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of stupid. I don't know. Like, my husband is like compromised because he's been recovering from cancer and has like susceptible to infection and stuff like this, and so I had to go get checked out, and they're not going to give me a test or anything because I didn't go to China or whatever.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, I know. So stupid. And so it's frustrating because I don't know, maybe I have it, maybe I don't, but like I'm just wiped out.
Mm.
Wiped out.
I'm sorry. I hope you feel better.
It's okay. It's okay. At least I can talk to y'all in my pajamas, you know. Been like sweating through my clothes at night. It's like crazy,
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah, apparently that's one of the symptoms. Like, I mean, like literally like sopping. I get up and I'm sopping. I've never had that happen to me before in my life. But anyway, we'll give it just another minute or so. See who else shows up. Um, I like your flower thing there. Is that a robe? You're sideways. You're on mute, Ariana.
I'm charging my phone, so it's sideways. This is like a, I think Betty Boop or something.
Oh, it's Betty Boop. Oh, I see. Yeah, is it a robe?
Yeah.
That's cool.
I saw this thing on Facebook, and it's like, remember to wear your jeans once a week. So you see, like, it's not a surprise. I've been like in this robe, and that's it.
Yeah, I've been pretty much, yeah, I'm not, I've been using it as an excuse to stay in my pajamas as long as humanly possible.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, why not? Going outside in my slippers and drinking tea and, watering my plants and hanging out with my dog and pig and, my kids inside doing their schoolwork and, I'm trying to stay away from them too. But anyway, all right, let's get this show on the road. Let's see. How many of you are there here? Oh, there's 10. All right. So for those of you who haven't done this before, what we're doing is we're sort of like, oh, there's even, wait, there's Matt. I didn't see where. Oh, there you are. And okay. So the system has this neat little feature where you can broken out into meeting rooms. Okay. So I'm gonna break you guys out kind of just like how I would in class, right? And so you'll kind of just chit chat about the readings for a little while. Um, and then we'll come back and talk. Okay. And if you guys have any other questions about anything at all, whether, when we're done, you know, um, feel free to ask and we'll go from there. Okay. So let me see here. Pick up. What we do. Okay. All right. So I've got you guys broken up and I'm gonna open up the rooms and I'll let you know. I'll give you some warnings and let you know when you guys are gonna be done and we'll go from there. Okay. So talk to you soon. Okay. Just make sure you join the meetings.
Like kind of different responsibilities, right? So, like they would have like different manufacturing, I guess, maybe.
It's more than that.
Well, more than
The asymmetric federalism had a lot to do with So, for example, they might have more autonomy. They might get more funding. They might get special rights or access to, the federal government for different types of, um, I don't know, like mining things or like whatever, just things economically, typically, right? Uh, so, um, and of course, again, from a position of having more independence, right? So this is why, wait, what was the one example they used as like the sort of big example in relation to asymmetric federalism? One of the republics. They talk about one example specifically.
The Kalamakia, the Republic of Kalamakia,
Where?
on page 134.
Oh, no, no, before that. So before actually it's mentioned on page 133, sort of in the middle. Is what actually sort of started the whole concept of asymmetric federalism. They don't really put it like that here, but that's what happened.
Tartarstan.
Yeah, Tartarstan, right? And so they actually held out, okay, and they uh, were threatening to secede, okay, and if they didn't get more access to the center, if because they felt like they had a lot of stuff, right, economically that they could provide, and that they wanted more equality with Moscow, right, than perhaps some of the other, regions or whatever that they felt didn't have as much to offer. And, their attitude was like, if we don't get what we want, we're leaving. And it was a big thing. It was like in the New York Times at the time and everything, that they were, going to succeed, and, they were in talks with Yeltsin and all of that. But really, it seemed more like they didn't really want to secede. Okay, they just were kind of holding out for what they could for as long as they could. But because they had, Yeltsin had the Chechens also, saber rattling about secession, and all of some other republics and stuff that had started to secede, that already had seceded, excuse me, in the Baltics, etc. Uh, you know, he just decided that he was going to compromise with Tatarstan, right? And so this created asymmetric federalism. It's very different than, see, like we have a federalist system here in the United States, right? Our Right? I mean, we're supposed to kind of. I can't hear you, Peter. What?
Playing out right now.
Right. No. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a little nutty what we got going on right now. But it's supposed to be a situation where the states have as much power as the federal government, right? And no one state has any more power than any other, right? And they all have the same access to aid if needed in case of federal emergency, right? They're all supposed to have access to, any federal funds in relation to education, based on percentage of population, things like that, right? They're all supposed to be granted the same stuff across the board, period, bottom line, right? And have access to, the president, the legislature, and all of that is needed, right? And that's how federalism is supposed to operate when it's optimal, okay? And the argument goes that when you have asymmetrical federalism, that is bad for regime stability, supposedly, or really not regime stability so much as state stability, right? But it ended up working kind of, I guess, in the Russian case, because they used asymmetric federalism as a method of regime stability, right? Because they were focusing on that as opposed to state stability. Do you know what I mean? So, like, because they really weren't working, I guess, Yeltsin thought he was kind of working on democracy, I suppose, but he was really, trying to consolidate his power and, ensure, his grip on power. And also, I guess he was assuming that, in doing so, that this would ensure that democracy would continue at the same time, perhaps, right? At least this is, his argument. Okay. And so, consolidating that and making these various types of concessions, so that, the communists would not gain back control or whatever, right? So, but again, in doing so, we had the situation in Chechnya, right? Which they talk about too in the asymmetric federalism thing. And they talk about why Chechnya was a bit different than some of the other cases. Do you remember why they said that? Anyone?
Because they were ethnically homogeneous republic,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
they were very nationalistic.
Right. Yeah. So in Chechnya, there are Russians, but there are fewer of them, like ethnic Russians, than there are in some of the other republics, right? Number one. If you look, I wrote a piece for the Encyclopedia of Informality about Chechen culture, right? And their culture is based in this in Sufi Islam, right? It's not like mainstream Shia Islam. It's a bit different. It's mystic, right? Hold on just a second. And there's two forms of it. There's the more mystic side, and then there's a warrior side. If you guys ever heard of Rumi, the poet Rumi, he's a I just said it and I can't. Why am I? Oh my gosh. I literally just said it and I lost it. And I think it's something's wrong with me. Okay. Anyway, he's the kind of Islam that they are. I can't believe I said it and I completely lost it. But anyway,
Sufi?
thank you. I don't know why I just lost that from my head. It just completely went out. But anyway, so Rumi is Sufi. Right. So if you've ever heard of him, whirling dervishes, if you've ever seen whirling dervishes, they're the guys that spin, like, and they wear like these white, long jackets and red, like fez kind of looking hats, and they spin and spin and spin. It's like a form of meditation. Anyway, they're also Sufi Muslims, but that's the more mystic side. there's the warrior side also, but it's meant to, it's very independent, right? They're very independent. You would almost say libertarian, like if you were going to try to connect it to something that you might know from a political stance, right? Highly independent. They, very like live free or die, kind of thing, right? And very nationalistic. And that's where the sort of like warrior sort of aspect come from, that culture. And so, but at the same time, they're very hospitable. They're very, all of that. But their culture is very, they've had lots of history. Sorry, I'm just not feeling well. They have lots of history of conflict with Russia, right? So going back to imperial times when they were having the czars try to conquer the steppe, right? And they saw Russia as being sort of their natural enemy, right? And so this sense of nationalism is sort of puts them at odds with Russia, right? Nationally and naturally, right? So while your book mentions this thing about the deportation, which I'll talk about in a minute, it goes back further than that, right? It goes back to Tsarist times of when they were initially conquered, right? And so they were assimilated into the Soviet Union next. The Soviets took over. And initially things were, kind of okayish because they largely left the republic to themselves. It wasn't until Stalin who decided, for whatever reason, that he felt that the Chechens had had collaborated with the Nazis, right? He got this idea in his head that they were collaborating with the Nazis. And so he decided that he was going to literally deport the entire population of Chechnya and Dagestan, right, who were ethnic Chechens, right? And so some 250,000 people, no, 500,000 people, right? 500,000 people were deported. And during this time period, right? And so it wasn't until after Stalin's death. So this was during World War II. It happened in the 40s, no, late 30s, early 40s. It wasn't until after Stalin's death that they were allowed to return to Chechnya. And by then, over half the population had died. Many of them died actually on the initial deportation out of Chechnya, because kind of like how, the Jews were crammed into these cars, right? These train cars. They did the same thing to the Chechens, and this was in winter, right? And many of them died in that process of deportation because of exposure, lack of food, lack of illness that they got that was being transmitted between each other, being packed in these trains. So, yeah, they were really upset about that, right?
Where deported to? Where were they deported to?
They were deported to, oh God, why am I forgetting? It wasn't Dagestan. It was like, Why am I forgetting this? I've written about this. I'm sorry. See, it's like the Sufi thing. I'm getting exhausted. I'm really sorry. Hold on. I'll look it up real quick. I can't believe I'm forgetting this.
And did Stalin have any real evidence that Chechens were collaborating with the Nazis, or did he just kind of make it up because he didn't like them?
Well, there's minor evidence that some evidence that there were some people like in the mountains who had because they were trying, again, they're very independent and they didn't like Stalin, and they were giving some information to you know the Germans, but not in active collaboration per se. But it was a very, the evidence is scant. And, if that's the case, it was not like a lot of people. Do you know what I mean? And so there was no need to accuse the entire population. Right? If you wanted to, and that's fine, go after individuals, that's one thing, that might have been doing something like this. But, going after the entire population is quite another. Yeah, it was in 1944. Yeah, it was Operation Lentil. Hold on. Just a second. Where did they go? Oh yeah, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. So they were put in camps in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. All right, so just like a couple republics over. I was going like this because I knew it was that way. That wouldn't mean anything to you. But anyway, so that's where they were put. And, it was Khrushchev who, when he became premier, right, he was like, we can't have an entire ethnic group in deportation. And, half of them are already dead. And if we keep this is going to make matters worse, the way it is. And so, like, he did several things at once. He emptied the gulags of prisoners, and he also allowed the Chechens to return home, right, to either Chechnya or Dagestan, wherever they were, right? But again, half of the population of ethnic Vanik, which are what the Chechens are called, that's their ethnicity, were gone, right? So that's not something you easily forget, okay? But they didn't really let it get to them, at least not where they wore it on their sleeve. Do you know what I mean? And they continued life. Many of the young Chechens just sort of assimilated into the Russian population, or Soviet population, became very Soviet. And post Stalin again, through Khrushchev and, following him, Brezhnev, and, all of them, they made a concerted effort to, integrate Chechens into the elite in some way, right? So that's how you get, like, the president that they talk about, Zhokar Dudayev. He was an elite military officer, right? He was highly decorated, all of that. And he knew Yeltsin. He'd met him on multiple occasions and stuff. and he actually never lived in Chechnya his entire life. He his family had left Chechnya, some before he was ever born, and so he saw himself as more Soviet, as Soviet first in forms of identity, rather than Chechen. And so when he was approached to be president by the sort of Chechen elite, he was like, I don't really know about any of this kind of stuff, but it was this difference of Chechen or Vanik identity, this long history of grievances that sort of made things a little bit different. But again, when they created their constitution, right, when they separated, it was a liberal democratic institution. I mean, it was largely secular in nature, even though they were a Muslim majority country, right? They were striving for democracy, equal rights, all of these sorts of things, and had said that they wanted a good relationship with Russia, but that just wasn't going to be good enough for Yeltsin, particularly people like Zhirinovsky, who was really sort of egging Yeltsin on along ethnic lines, because they were very concerned. He was very concerned about Shia violence, not, and it's so funny because throughout Soviet history and Russian history, they've always been concerned about Shia violence. And there's a difference between certain Shia terrorist groups, right? And like the Chechens, but of course I can see them being concerned about Chechen separatists because their aim is against Russia, right? But the real concern that was brewing underneath the surface at the time was the Sunni Muslims who were, Saudi Arabia had been exporting Wahhabism, through madrasas throughout Europe, throughout Asia, right? And there were many in Russia, particularly in North Caucasus, right? In Chechnya. And Chechnya had been asking for a long time for help with these Wahhabist elements, not really getting much help from Russia. And that was really the bigger problem, right? But anyway, I digress. So it's kind of unfortunate because they were really seeking a democratic path, right? And technically, being a republic, they had the right to secede, but they weren't given that opportunity. Anyway, what did you say, Peter? I'm stuck. Peter, were you going to say something?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. But anyway, so what about Putin and his approach to this whole thing? Blah, 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 blah. Let's move on to him for a second. So Putin's reforms and the rollback of regional power. What did they say about that? My thing is stuck. Okay, there we go. Anyone? So he wanted to roll back the power in the regions, right? Because he felt that they were getting a little too uppity, right? So what were the types of things that he was proposing? So on page 139, they talk about some stuff.
wanted to
Wait, Peter, stop. Hold on. You're gonna have to start again.
raise the status of presidential representatives and diminish the status of regional leaders and their autonomy. And he proposed a Federation Council no longer be made up of ex officio of regional executive and legislative heads. Instead, he wanted regional executives and legislators to send a representative to work in the Federation Council on a full-time basis.
Right. Right. So that's one thing. Just so we can kind of quickly go through this because we're running out of time. What else did he do? You guys can refer back to that. It starts on page 139. You could just make a little note for yourself. What else did he do?
He made changes to an existing law on the general principles of the organization of the legislative and executive state power and the subjects of the Russian Federation. So he proposed that the law be changed to permit the president to take action against the regional chief executives and their governors or presidents.
Right. So in other words, if they had done something that was in contradiction to the Constitution of the state of the Russian Federation, then he could take action against them or whatever, right? So before, Yeltsin was kind of like, go do what you want, right? And he was doing that again as a way to sort of get people to support him, right? Or at least not be, sort of like actively working against him, right? But again, that was problematic because it meant that there were people that were literally creating their own sort of like fiefdoms and creating their own like laws and how they wanted things to function and stuff like that, that sometimes is contradictory to state, the state constitution and stuff. And so Putin wanted to get rid of that, right? So let's okay. What else?
Also,
Go ahead.
he managed to pass a tax code that redistributed the tax revenue distribution. And it also required regional authorities to hand over an increased amount of revenue to the federal government.
Right. Okay. Because one thing that was happening under Yeltsin, and this was a major problem, right? So because of the power vertical that existed under Putin, under Yeltsin, or that it didn't exist, it existed on paper, right? And because of the lack of authority that the people within the power vertical had, right? And because the regional governors or Republican presidents or whatever, they had such power, they were essentially, can you hear me? Can you hear me, guys? Okay, so because they had so much power, right, they were essentially just deciding not to return taxes to the federal government, right? So they collect taxes, but then just not send them to the center. Okay, and so this was also part of why Russia was going through so many financial problems and having difficulty paying, different, federal agencies at different times, not only because of corruption that was happening at the national level within some of these institutions, but also it was, exacerbated by these Republican governors and, not Republican, governors of the Krais and oblasts, and then the Republican presidents, et cetera, not paying their taxes, right? Having the taxes from the regions not go to the center. So, and the other thing kind of goes to what you were talking about was the relationship between the center and the periphery, right? He wanted to reestablish that relationship as being, vital, right?
and that the periphery had to answer to the center, right? So any of the regions, the republics, which are referred to as the periphery, right? Anything outside the garden ring, right? They, had kind of gone wild. It was like Wild West, and he wanted to rein them back in and make sure that they understood who was boss, and so he did that. It was only Tatarstan who was able to get a sort of bilateral agreement where they had more power than some of the other peripheral republics or, Krais or oblasts or whatever. Okay.
Can we go into what Garden Ring is? Is that just within Moscow? Is that what that? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So once you get outside Moscow, that's pretty much, considered. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, anyway, yeah, go ahead.
So
You're cutting out, Matt, or you're frozen, Matt. I can't hear you. I still can't hear you. Hold on. Try it now.
okay. So if Putin had control over like the Duma and like a stranglehold on them with the whole, if they don't vote for something twice, then they resolve or dissolve. Why didn't he kind of like have more of an aggressive approach to the republics if like he had more power, I guess?
I guess probably because, he ultimately decided that, he was going to be appointing some of these people, right? And so he had some control already, right? So he, that was his way of gaining control, I guess, of some of the republics, right? Was saying that I'm going to appoint who the governors are. I'm going to appoint who the presidents are. Can you hear me? You're frozen again.
Yeah.
Okay. I have no idea what happened. But anyway, so I think he felt that, by creating that kind of control where people were specifically more answerable to him directly through creating that center periphery relationship thing, that that would have better control. Am I frozen or anything? Like, it keeps saying I'm unstable.
There you
Okay. So I think that that's why. And okay, so go ahead. Were you going to say something, Matt?
What was that?
You going to say something?
No.
Okay. So basically it ended up resulting in that, they realized they couldn't really challenge him, right? He had more control. And so, they were going to have to, either shape up or ship out. And they, liked having that kind of power, even if it was, the new people, right? They liked having power of a republic or, being a governor of a krai or an oblast. And it came with certain benefits, right? Perks, right? So long as you remain loyal to Putin and you did his bidding, you could stay in these posts and you can, ensure that flows of things were going to your region and blah, 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 and all this kind of stuff, right? So it kind of worked out, for a while.
So the republics kind of had like a quasi independence
Yeah,
for the
yes,
central state.
definitely. So republics typically what would happen is somebody of the ethnic titular population, right, within the elites would be appointed president of the republic, right? And there wasn't much incentive for the other republics to leave because, at the time, if you're thinking about, especially if you go back, right, to like when the republics were had the opportunity to break away from the Soviet Union, right? At that time, many of them were not doing very well economically. They may have had some resources, but they were like, we don't really know how to start a whole state, and we'd rather lean on Moscow, right, if possible, right? And so they felt like if they could just make a good deal with Moscow or whatever, that would be in their best interests, right? Particularly Tatarstan was feeling kind of that way too. They really didn't want to leave, but they were saying, we will if we have to. It was only really Chechnya that was, because of their unique situation. But the republics, even to this day, still have, lots of independence, as long as the president remains loyal to Putin. Now, it's kind of getting out of hand in Chechnya, right? And a lot of people talk about that they think that Razmadan, Kadyrov doesn't really, that he's kind of a bit of a rogue in a way, and that Putin can't really control him as much as he would prefer, and that he has too much power. But at the same time, because of Chechnya's unique situation, right, he feels like he's kind of hamstrung, right? He can't do much about it. And it's interesting, the dynamic in Chechnya too. It's like Chechnya is such an interesting place. It's ruled by clans, right? So it's, even though it's a more modern society, it has a clan-based structure. And there's a couple of main clans, right? Like in the Northeast, and kind of in like the sort of South-ish, right? And, up over here and blah, blah, blah. Kadyrov's clan, of course, they break into smaller clans, right? But the main clan is in the Northeast. And that particular clan has always been more, had a tendency to be more pro-Russia, right, than any of the other clans who were decidedly not, right? And so even though Kadyrov's father was initially very much for independence, somehow he was able to, they were able to turn him saying, well, we'll give you the president. Putin was like, I'll make you president, and I guess that made him, turn. But his clan has historically been pro-Russia. And so a lot of people in Chechnya don't particularly like, Ramazan, Kadyrov in general, but there is some animosity that exists between the clans based on that kind of relationship. Do you know what I mean? So anyway, so yeah, republics tend to have more independence, even under Putin, right? But they still have to have that loyalty dynamic, right? Much more so than under Yeltsin, right? It's just Chechnya is just in a weird circumstance. Anything else? Oh, well, you know what? It's 7:43, so we should probably wrap up. And we'll briefly talk about Chapter 7 in the next class. I want to limit it very briefly, and then we'll go on to the next module. Okay? Does anybody have any questions?
So we'll talk about Chapter 7 in the Kali book.
Yeah, just very briefly. I want to keep it short. It's the second part of the Putin chapter, right? Or is it? I can't remember.
Putin to
Yes.
It's about Putin.
Yeah. That's what I thought. So we'll briefly talk about that, and then we'll go on and do the first part of Robinson. Okay, or what is it again? Hold on. What is it we're supposed to read last time?
probably chapter 8, right?
Let me see. Chapter 8, political parties and opposition. Oh wait, I put so that's all we have to talk about. I accidentally put Putin 2 twice in the syllabus. So then that's kind of good because then we can kind of roll along. So chapter 8, political parties. So we'll and opposition. So we'll talk about that next time. Okay, and just a little bit of the Kelly book.
Just chapter.
7. Okay. All right. See you
All
guys.
right.
Have a good weekend.
You too.
Feel better.
Thanks. Bye bye.